Welcome to Lesson 2 of Section 10 of the BJCP training program from the Brewers Anonymous Homebrew Club. We are about to get into the details of wort production, starting with mashing. Mashing is the largest portion of this section, so we'll start with focusing on the different steps that can be included in the mashing process in this lesson. So to start with, what does the mashing process do for our beer, or more specifically at this phase, our wort? Mashing is a fundamental step in the brewing process where we break down the proteins and starches that began during the malting stage. This breakdown is essential for producing the sweet wort that will eventually be fermented into our beer. To achieve this, we rely on a variety of enzymes that work together at specific temperatures to degrade different components of the malt, specifically the complex carbohydrate starches and proteins. These enzymes play a vital role in determining the final characteristics of our beer, including its flavor, aroma, and overall quality. We do this process by adding our milled malts, and those are malts that have been run through a milling machine to crack open the husks and release these starches, proteins, and enzymes, and our adjuncts, if we're using any, into hot water. Now, how much hot water? That depends on the recipe and process we're following. There's several ways to calculate how much water we need, but luckily, that's a level of math we don't need to know for our entrance exam. You will want to know that when you get to brewing, but for our exam preparation purposes, we're not going to be covering that. Now, as far as the temperature of that hot water, that depends on what we're trying to achieve in our mash, or in a particular step in our mash. Various degree ranges do different things during the mash, and those we do need to know for our exam. Starting with the acid rest. This is where the enzymatic degradation begins. The conversion process now starts. The acid rest is typically done in the temperature range of 90 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. This temperature range helps release and activate two enzymes, phytase and beta-glucanase. Both of these have very specific purposes in the mashing process. Phytase breaks down the compound phytin. Phytin is the calcium-magnesium salt of phytic acid. It's found in plants mainly in the tubers and seeds, such as malted barley grains. Phytase breaks down the phytin into calcium and magnesium. Now these materials get incorporated into the mash and acidify the mash. We learned in our water section why that's important and what it does already. This process helps where the water is light on calcium content or roasted grains aren't used as part of the grist. Beta-glucanases target and break down hemicellulose. This is a substance in some fermentable grains that cause stuck mashes. Rye has extremely high levels of hemicellulose. If you've ever had a mash with a large amount of rye, you've probably dealt with hemicellulose, or at least the effects that large amounts of hemicellulose have in the form of a thicky, sticky residue-like substance that comes out in the mashing process. The next possible phase in the mashing process is the protein rest. The temperature range for the protein rest runs from 113 degrees to 127 degrees Fahrenheit. This is where the proteinases and peptidases are activated. These two have their specific function in the mashing process as well. The proteinases break down the high molecular weight proteins into smaller polypeptides. Once these proteins are broken down into smaller polypeptides, peptidases break those down into even smaller peptides and amino acids. All this conversion in the protein rest step is essential for yeast growth, yeast nutrition, and good head formation in our finished beer. Next phase possible in the mash process is starch conversion. This starts with the starches being gelatinized. Gelatinization of the starches happens in the 130 to 150 degree Fahrenheit range. It is worth noting that the temperature to gelatinize starches from raw grain do need to be a bit higher. To do that gelatinization process, they're typically boiled separately as part of a cereal mash when we're using non-flaked raw grains. The saccharification rest is a large part of the starch conversion phase as well. This is where the enzymatic activity really begins. This next part might be ringing a bell to you. This is where the alpha amylase and beta amylase break down the starch chains. We took a look at this when we were discussing malts and adjuncts in Section 8, Lesson 3 specifically. The alpha amylase breaks the 1,6 chain links in the starch chains, making more sugar chains, and the beta amylase break down the 1,4 chains, producing maltose units. The saccharification rest temperature range varies on the results the brewer wants to produce. Temperatures below 150 degrees Fahrenheit produce a more fermentable wort, ending with a drier, thinner, sometimes crispier beer. Temperatures above 155 degrees Fahrenheit produce a fuller, thicker, sometimes what's described as a chewy wort with more complex sugars and less fermentable sugars. There are different types of sugars produced during this phase that we need to know about for our exam. First one is monosaccharides. These are simple sugars comprised of one basic sugar structure in the molecule. These are easily consumed and converted by the yeast into alcohol and CO2. Monosaccharides include glucose, fructose, mannose, and galactose. Next is disaccharides. These are two monosaccharides coupled together. They're slightly more complex but still relatively easy to consume by the yeast. Disaccharides include maltose, isomaltose, sucrose, malleolose, and lactose. We also have trisaccharides. These are three monosaccharides joined together. There's one specific trisaccharide sugar we produce in brewing, and that is maltodextrose. And lastly, in this part of the conversation, we have oligosaccharides. These are the most complex sugars that we'll create in brewing, and they're in the forms of complex glucose strains. These will typically stay in the beer mostly or completely unfermented sugars in the form of dextrins. We have one more phase in the mashing process to discuss in this lesson, and that is the mash out. The mash out involves increasing the temperature to 168 degrees Fahrenheit and held at that temperature for several minutes. 10 minutes seems to be the most common amount of time for most brewers. This does a few things for our mash. It ensures the deactivation of amylase enzymes. With amylase enzymes now deactivated, the conversion of the fermentable sugars is halted. And it also reduces the viscosity of the wort and lends to a more efficient lautering, a process that we'll be covering in this section soon. There is some debate on if this step is necessary, but despite that debate, it is generally agreed that it does improve extraction percentage of the fermentable sugars from wort. The question that really remains is it enough of an improvement to warrant all that time and effort? When it comes to questions like that, for me, it comes down to the individual brewer to make that decision themselves. That's it for this lesson, but there is one more item I did want to share. We've talked a lot of numbers in this lesson, and as you probably know by now, when there are a lot of numbers to know for a given subject, there's a quick reference sheet available, and here it is. It's attached to this lesson to download and to use in the open book nature of your online exam if you choose to. So go ahead, it's there for the download. Take a look, have it ready. And with that, let's head on to the next lesson.